December 31st, 1942. The Barents Sea, deep inside the Arctic Circle, in the last hours of daylight, before an Arctic winter swallows the sky for weeks at a time. A convoy of 14 merchant ships, loaded with tanks, aircraft, and fuel bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk, is screened by just 6 British destroyers, none of them a match on paper for what is now closing in on them. A German raiding force built around the pocket battleship Lützow and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, backed by 6 more destroyers of their own, has been sent specifically to wipe this convoy off the map. The senior officer commanding the British escort has, at most, a handful of light guns and a handful of torpedoes against ships that could sink his entire force without coming within visual range of real danger. What he chooses to do next, use the threat of an attack he has no intention of completing, will talk one of the most powerful cruisers in the German Navy into simply turning around and leaving. This is the story of the Battle of the Barents Sea and the destroyer captain who bluffed his way to victory while badly outgunned at the cost of his own eyesight. By the end of 1942, the Arctic convoy route to the Soviet Union had already earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous supply lines of the entire war. Convoy PQ-17 scattered on Admiralty orders that summer in the mistaken belief that the battleship Tirpitz was about to attack, had been torn apart by U-boats and aircraft once it lost the protection of a concentrated formation, losing the majority of its ships and becoming one of the costliest convoy disasters of the war. Convoy JW-51B, sailing at the very end of December, carried roughly 2,500 vehicles, well over 100 aircraft, and tens of thousands of tons of fuel, material Stalin's forces on the Eastern Front badly needed through the depths of a Russian winter. German intelligence, tipped off by a U-boat sighting on the 30th of December, reported the convoy as lightly escorted and vulnerable, and the German Naval Command in Norway launched Operation Rainbow, sending Lützow and Hipper, escorted by 6 destroyers, out from their Norwegian anchorage specifically to intercept and annihilate it. Against this, Captain Robert Sherbrooke commanded a close escort of just 6 destroyers aboard his flagship Onslow, alongside Obedient, Obdurate, Orwell, and Achates, plus smaller minesweepers and armed trawlers. Further back, out of immediate contact, sat a distant covering force under Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, the cruisers Sheffield and Jamaica, positioned to reinforce if needed but not present at the opening of the engagement. On paper, this was as lopsided a mismatch as any convoy escort faced during the entire war. Lützow alone carried 6 11-inch guns to Sherbrooke's destroyers' 4 7-inch main armament, and Hipper's 8 8-inch guns and heavier armor meant that in a straightforward gunnery duel at any reasonable range, the British destroyer screen had essentially no realistic way to win or even to survive contact for very long. If the German force pressed its attack with any real determination, the calculation on both sides going in suggested the convoy, and quite possibly Sherbrooke's entire destroyer force, should have been destroyed. What the tonnage tables on the German side could not account for was the extremely narrow set of orders under which Vice Admiral Oskar Kummetz, commanding the German force, had actually been sent to sea. Hitler, deeply anxious about losing capital ships after a string of embarrassments earlier in the war, had personally insisted that his surface raiders avoid unnecessary risk, meaning Kummetz was operating under instructions not to commit his most valuable ships, Lützow and Hipper especially, to a fight if there was serious danger of losing them, even against a plainly weaker opponent. Sherbrooke did not know the precise wording of those orders, but as the action unfolded, he correctly read the pattern in how cautiously the German ships were actually fighting, and built his entire defense around exploiting that hesitation rather than trying to match German firepower directly. At around 8:20 on the morning of the 31st, British lookouts spotted unidentified destroyers trailing the convoy, and shortly after, Onslow's crew identified Admiral Hipper herself, closing from astern. Sherbrooke ordered Onslow, Orwell, Obedient, and Obdurate to peel off and intercept the German cruiser directly, while Achates stayed close to the merchant ships, laying a heavy smokescreen to hide them from view. After an initial exchange of gunfire in which Sherbrooke's destroyers were badly outmatched and 1 British destroyer was damaged, the British ships turned as if beginning a coordinated torpedo attack run. Sherbrooke understood exactly what he actually held in his hand. His torpedoes were, gun for gun, the only weapon aboard his ships capable of seriously threatening a heavy cruiser, but firing them meant using up the one credible threat that was currently keeping Hipper at arm's length. The bluff worked. Admiral Hipper, under orders not to risk herself needlessly, pulled back rather than close the range and risk taking a torpedo hit from a weaker force that, on paper, she should simply have been able to outgun and destroy outright. If you're finding this account of a destroyer captain talking his way past a heavy cruiser interesting, subscribing helps the channel keep telling these stories properly. Hipper returned for a second attempt shortly afterward, and this time the exchange went badly for the British screen. Hipper's gunfire struck Onslow directly, causing serious damage and killing 17 of her crew. A large steel splinter from the explosion badly wounded Sherbrooke himself, costing him the sight in one eye, though he refused to leave his post immediately and continued directing the action from Onslow's bridge before command was finally passed to Obedient, so the battle could continue without interruption. Through all of this, Fort invisibility repeatedly cut to almost nothing by a combination of smoke screens and driving snow squalls. The German force still failed to press home a decisive attack on the merchant ships themselves, distracted and delayed by the repeated threat of British torpedo runs and the confusion of the weather. Around this point in the action, the cruisers Sheffield and Jamaica, part of the distant covering force, finally arrived on the scene and engaged the German ships directly, catching the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt by surprise and sinking her, and scoring damaging hits on Hipper herself. By the time the action broke off, the results were almost the exact inverse of what the original balance of firepower had suggested should happen. The convoy's escort had lost the destroyer Achates, sunk covering the merchant ships with smoke to the very end, and the minesweeper Bramble, while suffering serious damage to Onslow and heavy casualties among her crew. Against this, the far more powerful German force had lost the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt outright and taken damaging hits on Hipper, without sinking or seriously damaging a single one of the 14 merchant ships they had been sent specifically to destroy. Every ship in convoy JW-51B reached the Soviet port of Kola Inlet safely, delivering its full cargo of tanks, aircraft, and fuel intact. The reaction in Berlin was immediate and, from the German Navy's perspective, career-ending. When news reached Hitler that his most powerful available surface raiders had been fought to a standstill and driven off by a handful of destroyers protecting the very convoy they had been sent out specifically to annihilate, he flew into a rage, reportedly threatening to scrap the entire German surface fleet and melt it down for scrap metal rather than continue funding ships that, in his view, refused to fight when given the chance. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the architect of Germany's big ship navy, resigned within weeks and was replaced by Karl Dönitz, the U-boat commander, who had long argued that German naval resources were better spent on submarines than capital ships. From that point onward, German naval strategy shifted decisively away from large surface raiding operations of exactly this kind, a change historians have often described as marking the effective end of the German surface fleet's role as an offensive weapon in the Atlantic and Arctic. Captain Robert Sherbrooke was awarded the Victoria Cross for his leadership of the escort, a battle he had fought and largely won after losing the sight in one eye partway through it. Nothing about Sherbrooke's 6 destroyers matched what they were sent up against. A pocket battleship and a heavy cruiser, backed by 6 destroyers of their own, represented a mismatch in guns, armor, and tonnage that should have ended with a convoy destroyed and a British escort force wiped from the sea. What actually decided the battle was Sherbrooke correctly reading his opponent's hesitation, understanding that the threat of a torpedo attack he had no intention of completing was, in that specific moment, worth more than the torpedoes themselves, and refusing to let a wound that cost him an eye take him off the bridge before the convoy was safely clear. Every merchant ship got through. The heavier, better-armed German force went home having sunk nothing it came for. And the argument that followed in Berlin ended the German Navy's big ship ambitions for the rest of the war.